During decades, military archives kept this story in total secrecy. No soldier who participated wanted to talk about what really happened that night in the Ardennes. But today, you're going to discover why. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. And if you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel for more daily documentaries. Ready? Now turn up the volume and let's begin. It began with a letter, a yellowed piece of paper folded neatly among hundreds in a forgotten box at the National Archives in Washington. The letter, dated December 19th, 1944, was written by a young lieutenant named James Wilson, a black officer serving in the 761st Tank Battalion. His words, scrawled in haste during one of the most critical moments of the Second World War, revealed a story that had been deliberately buried for decades. "They mock us from across the field," Lieutenant Wilson wrote. "The Germans have been broadcasting messages specifically targeting us, telling us to go home, that this isn't our fight, that America doesn't even want us. But what they don't understand is that we're about to show them exactly why they should fear us." The 761st Tank Battalion, known unofficially as the Black Panthers, was one of the few all-black combat units in the United States Army during World War II. Activated on April 1st, 1942, at Camp Claiborne, Louisiana, they trained for over 2 years before being deployed to Europe. Despite their extensive preparation, they faced constant doubt from white military leadership. General George Patton himself reportedly said, "I don't know if these men have the guts to fight," just days before attaching them to his Third Army. The military establishment had relegated most black soldiers to service and support roles, driving trucks, building roads, loading ships, anything but combat. But the 761st was different. They had demanded the chance to prove themselves on the battlefield, and in late 1944, that opportunity finally came. The German propaganda machine had studied America's racial divisions carefully. They understood that racism was America's Achilles heel, and they exploited it relentlessly. Radio broadcasts in English specifically targeted black soldiers, questioning why they would fight for a country that treated them as second-class citizens. Leaflets dropped from planes showed images of lynchings in the American South alongside text, asking, "Why die for a country that doesn't care if you live?" These psychological operations were designed to demoralize and divide, to create doubt in the minds of men already fighting 2 wars. One against fascism abroad and another against racism at home. According to declassified intelligence reports reviewed decades later, the German High Command initially believed that black American soldiers would be ineffective in combat due to what they considered racial inferiority, a grotesque extension of their own twisted ideology. This belief led them to specifically target sectors where black units were known to be stationed, expecting to find weakness. Military historian Dr. Eleanor Richardson, in her 1967 analysis of German tactical decisions, wrote, "Their racist ideology blinded them to the reality they were about to face. They saw the deployment of black units as an opportunity, not a threat." It was perhaps the most consequential miscalculation of the European theatre. The story begins in earnest on the morning of December 27th, 1944. The Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's last desperate offensive on the Western Front, was in full swing. The German advance had created a massive bulge in the Allied lines, threatening to split the American forces in 2. The 761st Tank Battalion, having arrived in Europe just weeks earlier, was rushed to the front near the town of Tillet, Belgium, where German forces had broken through. The temperature had dropped well below freezing. Snow covered everything. Men's breath formed clouds in the bitter air. Many of the tankers had never experienced such cold, coming as they did from America's South and Midwest. Staff Sergeant Curtis Jackson, from Birmingham, Alabama, recorded in his field journal that night, "Most of these boys have never even seen snow before, and now we're fighting in it. Our hands freeze to the metal of our tanks. But not one man has complained. Not one man has shown fear. They called us an experiment back home. Well, I guess we're about to show them what this experiment can do. The 761st was attached to the 187th Infantry Regiment, part of the 26th Infantry Division. Their orders were simple but daunting. Help stop the German advance and then push them back. For men who had spent 2 years training while being told they weren't fit for combat, the moment of truth had arrived. They had 6 dozen Sherman tanks, mechanized beasts weighing 33 tons each, armed with 75mm main guns. But the men inside these steel machines knew that German tanks were technically superior. The Panther and Tiger tanks they would face had thicker armor and more powerful guns. In a head-to-head engagement, the American Shermans were outmatched. Lieutenant Colonel Paul Bates, the white commander of the 761st, gathered his officers on the evening before their first major engagement. According to Captain David Williams's account, documented in 1963, Colonel Bates didn't give us some dramatic speech. He simply said, "Gentlemen, tomorrow we have the chance to make history, not just as soldiers, but as Americans. Remember your training, trust each other, and bring our men home." It wasn't until much later that I realized how much faith he had placed in us at a time when few white officers would do the same. Dawn broke on December 28th with the sound of distant artillery. German forces had been spotted moving toward the American positions outside Tillet. Radio intercepts, later documented in military intelligence reports declassified in 1968, revealed that the German commanders had identified the presence of the Black Tank Battalion and considered it an opportunity to break through the American lines. "The enemy has deployed their Negro troops against us," one German officer reported to his superiors. "We should concentrate our efforts there, as they will likely break under pressure." What happened next has been pieced together from after-action reports, personal accounts, and military records that remained classified until the 1960s. As German armor approached the American positions, they broadcast messages over loudspeakers in English. "Attention, Negro soldiers! Your white officers will sacrifice you while they escape. Return home to your families. This is not your war." The psychological warfare was accompanied by a barrage of artillery designed to break the will of troops the Germans had deemed inferior. Private First Class Marcus Johnson, a loader in one of the Sherman tanks, described the moment in a letter home that was only discovered after his death in 1982. "We could hear them talking to us, trying to get in our heads. Some of the boys were angry, others just laughed it off. Sergeant Miller told us, 'Let them talk. We'll answer with our guns.' And that's exactly what we did." The 761st held their positions, waiting until the German armor was within effective range of their Sherman tanks. The order to fire came not with a dramatic command, but with the quiet professional tone of men who knew their business. Target identified. Panzer at 2 o'clock. Fire when ready. The first shots from the black tankers found their marks. 3 German tanks were hit in the initial exchange, sending plumes of black smoke into the winter sky. The German forces, surprised by the effectiveness and discipline of the unit they had expected to crumble, intensified their assault. For 6 hours, the battle raged across the snow-covered fields outside Tillet. The 761st lost 11 tanks that day, but they destroyed 17 German armored vehicles and held their position. By nightfall, the German advance in their sector had been halted. The men spent that night repairing what equipment they could, tending to their wounded, and preparing for the next day's fight. Captain Harold Cohen, the battalion surgeon, worked through the night treating wounded tankers. In his medical log, he wrote, "These men fight with extraordinary courage, knowing that they face prejudice from both sides of the line." Several of the wounded asked only when they could return to their tanks. Their dedication would shame many who doubted them. The morning of December 29th brought clear skies and renewed German determination. Intelligence reports indicated that additional German forces had been diverted to break through what they still perceived as a weak point in the American lines. According to records from the German 7th Army, recovered after the war, they had designated the sector held by the 761st as Schwerpunkt, the point of main effort. It was a decision they would come to regret. The black tankers had used the night to prepare an ambush. Rather than meeting the German advance head-on, they positioned their tanks in concealed locations along the likely approach routes. When the German armor appeared, advancing confidently toward what they believed would be minimal resistance, the 761st struck from multiple directions. The surprise was complete. 8 German tanks were destroyed in the first 10 minutes of the engagement, their crews never knowing what hit them. Radio operator specialist James Thompson recalled in an oral history recorded in 1961. "You should have heard their radio chatter when they realized who was hitting them. They couldn't believe it was us. The same black soldiers they'd been mocking just the day before. One of our German-speaking officers translated their transmissions for us later. They were calling for reinforcements, saying they were under attack from an elite American unit. Elite. That's what they called us after just one day of fighting. By midday, the German forces in the sector were in retreat. What had been planned as a significant breakthrough had turned into a costly failure. The 761st, rather than being satisfied with holding their ground, received orders to pursue the retreating Germans. Lieutenant Colonel Bates hesitated only briefly before confirming the command. Panthers moving forward. It was the first time in the European theatre that an all-black combat unit had gone on the offensive. The advance was methodical and professional. The tankers moved in coordinated formations, supporting the infantry of the 187th Regiment. They liberated 3 Belgian villages by nightfall, pushing the German forces back nearly 7 miles. A Stars and Stripes correspondent who witnessed the action wrote in his notebook, though the story was never published, "These Negro tankers fight with a determination that must be seen to be believed. Perhaps they understand better than most what this war against fascism truly means." The following week saw the 761st continue their push eastward, participating in what had become a general Allied counter-offensive. The Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's last gamble in the West, was failing, and in one crucial sector it was failing because a group of soldiers, deemed inferior by both their enemies and many in their own army, had proven themselves to be among the best. By January 7, 1945, the immediate crisis had passed. The 761st was reassigned to support operations in other sectors, continuing to build what would become an extraordinary combat record. By the end of the war, they had served for 183 consecutive days in combat, liberated 30 towns, and played key roles in major operations, including the Battle of the Rhineland and the final drive into Germany. They suffered 356 casualties, including 24 men killed in action. But despite their achievements, recognition was slow in coming. When the war ended in Europe on May 8, 1945, the 761st received no parades upon their return home. Their story was largely untold. The propaganda that had been so concerned with presenting an idealized image of American unity had little interest in highlighting the contributions of black soldiers. As the unit's official history noted, with understated bitterness, "We were good enough to fight for our country, but not good enough to be recognized for it." Are you following so far? Help us bring this story to more people. Like the video, comment if you already knew about this case, and subscribe to the channel. Now, let's return to the point where everything changed. The silence surrounding the achievements of the 761st might have lasted indefinitely, if not for the persistence of a few determined individuals. In 1963, a graduate student named Howard Williams was researching racial integration in the military when he stumbled across mentions of an all-black tank battalion that had distinguished itself during the Battle of the Bulge. Intrigued, He requested access to their unit records, only to be told that much of the material remained classified. His subsequent Freedom of Information Act requests were repeatedly delayed or denied. Williams later recalled in his 1969 book, Forgotten Valor, "It became clear to me that this wasn't routine bureaucratic obstruction. There seemed to be a deliberate effort to keep the story of the 761st buried. The question was, why?" That same year, civil rights movements were transforming America. Black Americans were demanding recognition, rights, and a full accounting of their contributions and sacrifices. The timing of Williams' discovery was significant. His initial research, published in the Journal of Military History in 1964, caught the attention of several veterans of the 761st, who began to speak publicly about their experiences for the first time. Sergeant Henry Jefferson, who had commanded a tank during the crucial battles in Belgium, told the Baltimore Afro-American newspaper in 1965, "We were told to be quiet about what we'd done. When we got home, our white officers were awarded medals, but most of us received nothing. They said it was for operational security, but the war had been over for 20 years. What were they still trying to hide?" What they were hiding began to emerge as more documents were declassified and more veterans came forward. The full extent of the 761st's accomplishments had been deliberately downplayed. Their crucial role in blunting the German offensive during the Battle of the Bulge had been attributed to other units in official histories. Recommendations for medals and citations had been buried or ignored. And perhaps most significantly, the unit's success directly contradicted the prevailing military doctrine that had relegated black soldiers to support roles based on the racist assumption that they lacked the courage and ability for combat. A Pentagon memorandum dated March 19, 1945, discovered by researchers in 1967, revealed the thinking at the highest levels. The success of Negro combat units, particularly the 761st Tank Battalion, presents a complex problem for post-war military planning. Their performance contradicts long-standing policies regarding the assignment of Negro personnel. Recommend minimal publicity of their operational record while we evaluate implications. This minimal publicity extended to active suppression of their story. When Hollywood produced films about the Battle of the Bulge in the 1950s and 60s, the role of black combat units was erased entirely. When military historians wrote accounts of the decisive battle, the 761st was often reduced to a footnote, if mentioned at all. The men who had helped save the Allied line from collapse returned to an America still deeply segregated, their service unacknowledged. Leonard Smith, a tank commander who had destroyed 3 German panzers during the fighting around Tillit, put it succinctly in an interview for a 1966 documentary that was ultimately never completed. "We faced the Nazis and defeated them. Then we came home and faced the same old racism. The Germans called us inferior to our faces. At least they were honest about their hatred. Back home, they smiled while they kept us in our place." The discovery of Lieutenant Wilson's letter in 1967, the same letter mentioned at the beginning of this account, added a new dimension to the emerging story. Found by a researcher examining uncatalogued materials at the National Archives, it provided a contemporaneous account of the German psychological operations targeting the black tankers and the unit's determination to prove themselves. More importantly, it led researchers to a collection of personal papers, diaries and photographs that several members of the 761st had entrusted to Wilson after the war. These materials, which Wilson had kept secure until his death in 1962, included photographs of the unit in action, detailed accounts of their battles, and copies of communications with higher headquarters that documented both their achievements and the resistance they faced from the military establishment. Most explosively, they included copies of medal recommendations that had never been processed and after-action reports that had been altered before being included in official histories. Major General John Sullivan, who had commanded the 26th Infantry Division during the Battle of the Bulge, was interviewed by the Washington Post in 1968 about these emerging revelations. Then in his 70s and retired, Sullivan confirmed what many had suspected. There was a concerted effort to minimize the contributions of the 761st. Some of my fellow officers couldn't accept that these men had performed so admirably. I tried to ensure they received proper credit, but I was overruled at higher levels. It's one of the great regrets of my career that I didn't fight harder for them. The publication of these accounts coincided with a broader reassessment of the role of Black Americans in the nation's military history. In 1968, the Department of Defense, responding to growing public pressure, initiated a review of awards and decorations that may have been denied due to racial bias. The following year, 7 veterans of the 761st Tank Battalion finally received the medals they had been recommended for during the war, including one posthumous Silver Star for Staff Sergeant Curtis Jackson, who had died in combat on January 25, 1945. The ceremony, held at the Pentagon on April 1, 1969, exactly 27 years after the battalion's activation, was both a moment of long overdue recognition and a painful reminder of how much had been lost to prejudice. Many of the unit's veterans had already passed away, never knowing that their service would eventually be acknowledged. Others had lived for decades with the bitter knowledge that their sacrifices had been deliberately forgotten by the country they had served. Acceptance of the full historical record came slowly. In military academies and staff colleges, case studies of the 761st began to appear in curricula during the 1970s, examining both their tactical achievements and the institutional racism that had nearly erased their story. The unit's experience became a lens through which to view the larger questions of race, recognition, and representation in American military history. Dr. Allison Carter, a military historian who specialized in the integration of the armed forces, wrote in her 1976 analysis, "The suppression of the 761st's achievements wasn't simply an injustice to those men. It represented a larger failure, the willingness to distort historical truth to maintain a system of racial hierarchy. The damage done extended beyond the individual veterans to our collective understanding of who bears the burden and makes the sacrifices in our wars." The Germans, who had once mocked the black tankers, had, in many cases, developed a grudging respect for them by the end of the fighting. Captured intelligence documents, declassified in the late 1960s, showed that German units had been specifically warned not to underestimate the 761st after their initial encounters. A directive from German High Command, dated January 8, 1945, instructed, "The Negro tank unit operating in the Ardennes sector has demonstrated exceptional combat effectiveness. Psychological operations against this unit have proven counterproductive and should be discontinued. They are to be engaged according to standard tactical doctrine for American armored forces." This reassessment by their enemies stood in stark contrast to the treatment the unit received from their own country's military establishment and historical record. The Germans had learned from direct experience what many American commanders refused to acknowledge, that courage, skill, and dedication were not determined by race. The propaganda that had called them inferior was proven false on the battlefield. Yet the prejudice that kept their story suppressed persisted long after the guns fell silent. For the men of the 761st, the recognition that finally began to come in the 1960s could not erase decades of silence. Captain David Williams, one of the few surviving officers, spoke at a reunion of the unit in 1971. "We never fought for recognition. We fought because it was our duty, and because we knew we could do the job when others doubted us. But the truth matters, the truth about what we did, what we sacrificed, and what we proved. Not just for us, but for all who came after us. The story of how the 761st Tank Battalion turned the battlefield around when the Germans mocked them is more than a tale of military achievement. It is a testament to courage in the face of doubts from both enemies and allies. It demonstrates how prejudice can blind people to the capabilities of others, leading to strategic miscalculations and historical injustices. And it reminds us that the full truth of our history is often more complex, more challenging, and more revealing than the simplified versions we are initially given. The men who served in the 761st came from across America, from Harlem and rural Georgia, from Chicago's South Side, and small towns in Mississippi. They had different backgrounds, different educations, different dreams for their futures. But they shared the experience of being black in a segregated America, and then they shared the crucible of combat. They faced the enemy's bullets and the Allies' distrust. They proved their worth on the battlefield, only to have their achievements minimized and forgotten for decades. Private First Class William Morris, who survived the war but lost his right leg in the fighting near the German border, reflected in a 1969 interview, "When we were in those tanks, facing the enemy, we weren't fighting just for America. We were fighting for ourselves, for our dignity, for the right to be seen as full men. The Germans thought we would break because we were black. Our own country thought we would fail because we were black. Proving them all wrong, that was worth everything we went through." Morris's words capture the dual battle that the men of the 761st fought, against fascism abroad and racism at home. Their victory on the battlefields of Europe was clear and decisive. Their struggle for recognition and respect in America would continue for decades, reflecting the nation's larger unfinished journey toward racial justice and equality. The story of the 761st is now included in most comprehensive histories of World War II, though still rarely with the prominence it deserves. Their experience has been the subject of books, documentaries, and museum exhibits. The unit received a Presidential Unit Citation in 1978, 33 years after the end of the war. Their battlefield achievements are studied by military tacticians, and their struggle for recognition is examined by historians of race in America. But perhaps the most meaningful legacy of the 761st Tank Battalion is found in the military that followed them. The integration of the armed forces, officially ordered by President Truman in 1948, was given impetus by the undeniable combat record of black units like the 761st. The gradual transformation of the military into one of the most integrated institutions in American society owes much to those black soldiers who demonstrated, under the most adverse conditions, that courage and capability know no color. In the archives now, among the thousands of documents that tell the story of the 761st, there is a faded photograph. It shows a Sherman tank on a snow-covered field in Belgium, its crew standing proudly beside it. The men are bundled against the cold, their breath visible in the winter air. They are smiling, these men who had just helped turn the tide of a crucial battle, who had just proven their doubters wrong. They could not know that their accomplishments would be minimized, that their recognition would be delayed, that the full truth of what they had done would be hidden for decades. In that moment, captured in that photograph, they knew only that they had been tested and had prevailed. The last documented veteran of the 761st Tank Battalion, Master Sergeant Robert Thompson, died in 2007 at the age of 84. With his passing, the living memory of that remarkable unit faded into history. But the lessons of their experience about courage, about prejudice, about the distortion of historical truth, and about the long struggle for recognition remain vitally important today. As we reflect on their story, we might consider the words that Lieutenant Colonel Paul Bates, the white commander who led the 761st with respect and confidence when many others doubted them, spoke at the unit's deactivation ceremony in 1945. History will record that you performed magnificently. If it does not, then history will be wrong. For too long, history was indeed wrong. The story of how the Germans mocked them until black soldiers turned the battlefield around was suppressed, minimized, and nearly lost. But truth has a power that transcends even deliberate forgetting. The achievements of the 761st Tank Battalion, obscured for decades, eventually came to light through the determined efforts of historians, journalists, and the veterans themselves. Their story now stands as both a proud chapter in military history and a sobering reminder of how prejudice can distort our understanding of the past. In the winter of 1944, on the snow-covered fields of Belgium, a group of black American soldiers faced mockery from their enemies and doubt from their allies. They responded with courage, skill, and determination that changed the course of a crucial battle. Their enemies learned to respect them. Their country took much longer to fully acknowledge what they had accomplished, but in the end, the truth of what they did could not be permanently hidden or denied. The 761st Tank Battalion, the Black Panthers, who turned the battlefield around when the Germans mocked them, deserve to be remembered not as footnotes in history, but as men who shaped it. Their legacy lives on in a military transformed by their example, and in a nation still working to fully live up to its founding promise of equality for all. As we conclude their story, we honor not just their military service, but their place in the long struggle for recognition, respect, and justice that continues to this day. Did you enjoy this story? Your support helps us continue producing new documentaries. A like, a comment, or a share makes all the difference. See more historical cases on our channel, and if you're not yet subscribed, join our community. I'll see you in the next episode.